Fab. So, thank you everyone for joining today, our first event of 2026, which is very exciting. So, thank you for everyone who's made the time to join. Um, Obviously, today we're going to be focusing in on inclusive hiring for 2026, and leading our session today, we've got Mike Bradshaw. So, Mike's got over 15 years experience working in leadership roles within talent and people. And he's currently the VP of Talent at Pinpoint, a leading ATS provider, who are one of our community partners as well. So he's very kindly given up his time today to share some of his wisdom. He's going to be obviously introducing himself better than I can, sharing some slides, and then we'll make sure we leave time at the end for any questions, and we'll make sure we wrap up at 1:30 on the hour as well, because we're mindful of everyone's time. If you've got any questions as we go along, please drop them in the chat. But as I say, we'll sort of come to everyone at the end as well. So please feel free to ask any questions live on the session as well. But I'll hand over to Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And hi, everybody. Appreciate you all inviting me and making time for me here, especially in the middle of the day and what I think is probably a pretty intense time for everybody in go-to-market hiring. I know for myself, I've got lots of racks going on right now. So for those that I haven't met before, like Helen mentioned, I am Mike Bradshaw. I'm the VP of Talent at Pinpoint. We are an ATS built for complex hiring, and we'll share a slide on that and then more information, of course. But before that, I've spent the last 15 years building hiring systems across early stage startups, scale ups, and a few mission driven organizations. Most of my work sits at the intersection of recruiters, hiring managers, and leadership teams. Probably very similar to what you all are doing, where things are moving fast, targets are aggressive, and hiring decisions carry real commercial risk. And so I think inclusive hiring, especially within go-to-market teams, lives right inside that tension. And that's what I'm going to focus in today. So we'll talk for a little bit, and then again, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. I want to start with that reality that most of you are likely living in. If you are a go-to-market recruiter right now, you are juggling a lot. You're expected to, of course, hire quickly, support ambitious revenue targets, deliver a competitive candidate experience, and at the same time, right, make sure that hiring is fair and inclusive. And often, especially in the context of sort of post 2023 tech layoffs and just the reality of the labor market that we're in right now, fewer resources, more roles potentially, and less patience from the business. And at the same time, I think when we talk about inclusive hiring, go-to-market hiring can amplify bias faster than almost any other function. Then, in my experience, I think that's because the decisions can happen under speed pressure. There's direct revenue accountability. Success is often described using highly subjective language when we talk about candidates, things like presence, confidence, polish. And those terms can feel neutral, but in a lot of cases, they're not. But most inclusion problems in go-to-market hiring aren't coming from bad intent. They're coming from rush decisions, vague roles, unstructured interviews, and certainly under a lot of pressure. Where I want to start, I think, is the part that often gets skipped a lot of times in DEI conversations, whether you're talking about broader DEI programs or inclusive hiring. And it's that inclusion fails fastest when companies don't take the time to clearly explain why it exists and what they're actually trying to change. When the why isn't clear for teams, whether it's for recruiters or the hiring managers that you're trying to enroll in the program or for your interview teams, inclusion can get experienced as arbitrary or political or unfair. People can assume or have this sort of perception that it's about lowering standards, favoring certain groups, or policing behavior. And none of that is actually true. And certainly none of those things would actually help you hire any better. So I actually think it's really helpful. There's a lot of questions we'll usually get in these sessions around getting buy-in and adoption. It's helpful to have, if you haven't already as an organization, to have those grounding conversations. And while this is not extensive in any way, shape, or form, I think there's some table stakes framing for why inclusive hiring matters, which I think is to simply acknowledge and say that, most of our hiring systems were built in a very different era. They relied heavily on informal networks, subjective judgment, and familiarity. Those systems worked best for people who already had access, who had credibility and margin for error. And that obviously advantaged some groups, excluded others by default, not necessarily because people were malicious, but because the system was never designed to work for everyone. So this work isn't about blaming individual people, hiring managers, or anybody for decisions that they made inside the roles that they inherited, but it is taking responsibility for those outcomes that those systems can potentially just inherently still produce. Because if you keep running the same hiring logic in a very different economy, you don't get neutral results. You will get predictable ones. And fixing that isn't just about being nicer people. It's about being honest that systems can feel fair on the inside while still being exclusionary on the outside, and actually choosing intentionally to redesign them. And that's why, inclusion isn't this vague aspiration. I think it can feel like that a lot of times when we talk about inclusion or DEI, but it's actually a set of very specific decision points. Be more inclusive is not actionable. But when we talk about hiring, some of these questions are, where does subjectivity outweigh evidence when we talk about hiring decisions, rejection decisions? At which stages do outcomes diverge? Who consistently gets filtered out and why? So inclusion really only works when it's translated into a clear, consistent process with documented decisions. It's not extra work. It's not performative. It is essentially an operating model. And when consistency becomes optional, when we talk about hiring, inclusion essentially disappears. And the cost will actually show up as slower hiring, poorer quality, and higher attrition for your team. And so what I want to do is actually walk through what inclusive go-to-market hiring actually looks like in practice, and what we can sort of do from a structure and operating model standpoint to ensure that we don't do those things. And I think the first part is really getting specific on job requirements early. Most bias, or where you can let bias, these sort of things slip in, starts before you ever speak to a candidate. And it really starts with the role design. Roles are often written around past hires, not future performance. A lot of times, hiring managers sometimes ask for carbon copies of what they already have rather than what the business actually needs next. And this is where we see things like that might be arbitrary. This might not be, but like degree requirements are a great example as a default filter. Do you really need a 4-year degree for this particular role? It may not be actually required for the job. And this isn't a great example, right? Because most Americans do not have a 4-year degree. And so when we add a degree requirement out of habit, we're just shrinking the pool and we're filtering for background rather than actual capability. Years of specific experience, specific companies they're coming from, very narrow credentials, then get used as proxies of competence. That's not equality. It's definitely not equity. And so I think when you think about inclusive hiring from a design standpoint, from job spec, job intake with the hiring manager, it's a simple principle. If someone can do the job, the process should give them a fair chance to show it. And so practically, that means forcing clarity early, especially on the things the hiring managers may want to skip or maybe don't think about talking through, which is, what does success look like at 3 months, at 6 months, at 12 months? What absolutely needs to be present in the candidate from a skill set standpoint on day one? What could realistically be learned on the job with the right support, onboarding, coaching? And this is where skills-based hiring can be really effective, because when job descriptions focus on core skills instead of brand names, degrees, arbitrary experience thresholds, two things happen. One is you widen the pool and you reduce rework later because you're actually hiring against what drives the performance ultimately when they're in seat, not just this sort of unspoken mental model. And I think this is one of the highest leverage intervention points that recruiters have early on in the process. So that's the first point. The second one is making sure that you're structuring interviews, excuse me, and resisting and helping hiring managers and interviewees resist that sort of gut feel. And this is where inclusion either holds or collapses in your process. And again, as I mentioned, it breaks down when consistency becomes optional. Recruiters, we are operators. We design the system that decisions sit inside. And gut feel is rarely neutral. It's usually unexamined pattern matching, and we should be honest about what it patterns towards. We know that gut feel reliably rewards people who look, sound, and behave like the people who already hold power or decision making in the organization. It feels neutral because it feels familiar, But familiarity is one of the most exclusionary forces in hiring and go-to-market hiring, especially when confidence and polish can get mistaken for competence. So if you have structured interviews, they don't slow down hiring. Again, they will reduce rework, they will reduce disagreement and second guessing when it comes to candidate decisions. And when every candidate is assessed against the same criteria using the same questions, the decisions become clearer and faster and fairer. And at Pinpoint, we use structured scorecards to anchor interviews. They're to job relevant evidence. So it's not about vibes or just confidence or who feels like one of us. The structure allows recruiters to push back safely and constructively when decisions don't line up. It's not about inclusion initiative or where this candidate comes from or the demographic information. It's the rejection decision or the decision where to move the candidate and what we're going to do with that candidate is based on the criteria that we've outlined that we agreed upon that was important. It's consistent and it's defensible and it's fair. So the next part is just really what candidates are expecting from hiring on the flip side of this. And I think candidate expectations, have changed over the years and they have more tools, they have more information, have more options. And especially when it comes to sourcing those high value candidates that have been really stuck in an organization for a long time. If you are a high growth startup, you might look more risky. It's a difficult conversation to pull them from their current opportunity. And I think candidates are really good at spotting misalignment pretty early. Chaos reads as culture, but they're not looking for perfection, but they do expect clarity, they expect fairness, they expect responsiveness and follow through. And I think that respect for time isn't just a courtesy issue. And the point here is that 4A is really about inclusion because it's an economic one. When we talk about work assignments or skills assessments, unpaid projects, vague timelines, endless rounds, they don't just test motivation, they test who can afford to stay in the process. When your hiring process assumes everyone has spare time, financial cushion, and emotional bandwidth, you are not selecting for talent, you're essentially selecting or optimizing for privilege. At Pinpoint, when we ask a candidate to do something, to submit a work assignment, a project, whatever it might be, we pay them for that. We think that's fair. We don't think that people should do things for free, not because it's generous, because unpaid labor is a tax on people without safety nets. And so if your hiring process only works for people who can absorb that cost, your team is going to reflect that, whether you intend to or not. I think when we talk about the end, we've talked about sort of the beginning part, the structure, the interview process, decision making. And I think though that after the sort of interview and offer stage is really important as well. It's easy to think of inclusive hiring as something that just happens during interviews, but bias can obviously show up at any point during the process, including, of course, decisions in the offer stage and where it can be the most visible. If underrepresented candidates consistently exit your process at final stage and never return, that's not a sourcing problem. It is a signal problem. And this is why having data is really important. We'll talk about that. It tells you something is breaking down and how decisions are made, how they're communicated or followed through or not followed through. And I think this is why nurturing final stage talent can also matter. I think when candidates have that positive experience through, even if they don't receive the offer, they're more likely to reapply in the future. The flip side is just as important. 40% of job seekers report, being after ghosted after a second or third round interview. Obviously, we know it doesn't just damage the trust in the moment, it weakens your future pipeline. But it's also why we're seeing TA teams invest more in candidate nurturing and follow up in this year. So how you close the process determines whether you're building long-term talent or starting from scratch every single time. And it's a signal to those candidates from underrepresented groups. So there's a couple ways to avoid this, how you take the candidates through offer. At offer stage, you want to fall back on the same skills-based reasoning you use throughout the process. The evidence should be there, captured in your scorecards in the ATS, so the final decision doesn't drift back to instinct. I think transparency matters here as well, especially around salary bands. So when you get to that offer stage, if you haven't posted the salary, I haven't talked about that throughout the process. This is going to cause a pay equity issue in your organization. We know that men are statistically much, much more likely to negotiate their salary. And so these clear ranges, they don't lower standards. They aren't going to drive your cost up. They reduce inequity by removing guesswork and power imbalances from the conversation. And this is another reason why documenting these decisions matter. Um, I think for the other final stage candidates, a couple things to talk through before we get to the last part, and then we'll get to questions. It's important to think about the candidates that you don't hire. And keeping final stage candidates engaged doesn't only mean the person who receives the offer. Um, Candidates from underrepresented backgrounds are less likely to reapply after a negative rejection experience. And that means sloppy or impersonal final stage handling can quietly drain the diversity from your pipeline over time more than other candidates. And so, thoughtful follow up, clear communication, detailed rejection feedback, these are things that are table stakes for any recruiting op. So, again, when we talk about meaningful inclusion, it's not extra steps. These are things that we should be doing across the board for candidates. What is going to be good for an inclusive hiring process is going to be good for all of your candidates. And so that's just something that you want to have in your process. And when you nurture those talent pipeline, when you're investing in those candidates, you're making sure that your second round or their silver medalist candidates or the candidates that maybe aren't the right match have that good experience. Obviously, it's a pipeline you can draw from for that next role when it comes down for that next opening. The last part is this is why an ATS obviously matters more than ever. Your ATS isn't just a filing cabinet, it's this operating system for inclusive hiring. All the things we talked about, it should enable you to do that. When we talk about role design, interview structure, decision, and the data, when we talk about when people are withdrawing from your process or dropping out, or to find who's making it through your stages and the representation by stage, your ATS is going to help you get that information. One of the real values of a strong ATS is that it removes plausible not deniability. When decisions are documented, patterns can't hide behind it just felt right. And that can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is essentially the price of fairness. Systems don't reduce bias because people suddenly become better necessarily. They reduce bias because people are held accountable. There's structure and they lose the ability to improvise essentially. And so your ATS can be that partner, the structure and guardrails. If you take the time to design and put the process together, the ATS is going to be the one to enable you to do that. So just to recap, I think inclusive hiring, go-to-market hiring isn't really about doing more. It's doing fewer things better and earlier, working closely with the hiring manager to define what success actually looks like, using structure to reduce reliance on gut feel, documenting decisions so patterns can actually become visible so your team can understand and learn, and treating final stage candidates as long-term talent, not just dead ends. And I think when hiring doesn't depend on who's in the room or how rushed things feel, inclusion can stop being so fragile in your process. And I think, the strongest signal of success isn't necessarily a DEI dashboard. Obviously, there's lots of great signals and directional things you can look at, but it's really it's retention, it's satisfaction, it's teams that perform and stay inclusion initiatives and recruiting and even just in your teams are going to benefit everybody. Retention is going to be the sort of North Star that's impacted by all of these things. So that's it. I'll send it back to Helen for questions. I hope that was helpful.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Mike. I'll open the floor then to questions. Did anyone have anything to follow up there with Mike? Any questions as we went along?
Got one. I guess like when did you guys start paying candidates for exercises that they were doing, and how I guess like how have you been tracking? Like, have you seen better quality hire over that time? Have you seen the funnel be acting like you've seen more people more engaged? Do you tell candidates we're going to pay you for this, and then they are more apt to make sure that they pursue the job all the way through because it's paid for?
Yeah, great question. I took on this role of Pinpoint in 2023. And the company, just for the nature of being bootstrapped, that was really when the growth started. So there wasn't a lot of hiring data before that. They weren't doing it before that. So I don't have enough of like before and after, quite honestly. We do make that really clear up front. And so one of the nice things on Pinpoint is when you apply for a job, you can post the hiring. So when you go and you say account executive and it has the typical job posting and the salary, we put the hiring process right there, which is nice because another thing we want to be clear about is that you're not entering a 10 interview process. It's going to be a 3 or 4 stage process. But one other thing on there is we put paid assignment or paid assessment, whatever it might be. We make that clear from the start. And for us, about 45% of the people that we hire are sourced. So I will go out and I about almost half, right? I go out and hire, I go out and source. And when I'm pulling somebody, right, I think if you're securing your job and someone reaches out to you and you look and you see there's going to be an assignment, you might be 50-50. You might be like, I don't have time for that. I don't want to do that. But if it's compelling enough and you do see it's paid, not only you might be more willing to do it, but it also sends a signal about the company and the culture and how they sort of value people. So I don't unfortunately have data to say, hey, listen, because of this, we had 20% less drop off. I wish I did. But like the feedback we get anecdotally from candidates consistently, even ones that go through the process and are rejected, is like how much that stood out. It shows up in our employee surveys a lot too. It's a common thing that our employees say a lot about, like even ones that have been here 2 years when they give their surveys around like their Pinpoint experience, how it stands out. So I think it does make a really big difference in terms of converting candidates, converting source candidates. Um, um, but I don't have enough of the before and after, unfortunately.
Thank you. Do you know how much you've spent on panels or those case studies or exercises for over the past fiscal year?
Yeah, so last year, I mean, for us, so I think we did, I think we hired 30 people last year, and I think we spent a little under $10,000. So, like for example, these are generally, not generally, they're always third or fourth stage. So all of our hiring processes are 4 stages max. The exception might be if we're hiring a VP level, right? There might be a fifth stage or something like that. So all the roles are 3 or 4 stages. These are things that are going to be for the finalish candidates. So a typical role will see somewhere between 2 and 5 people max that would actually complete these.
Mm.
And we will pay them anywhere between $150 and $300, depending on the complexity and time that they is required for it. So I think last year was like, I think it was somewhere like 8,500 was like what we spent across 30 roles essentially.
Thank you.
Hmm?
There's just a follow-up question in the chat around that topic as well, about do you pay through an invoice or another medium? Apparently, like some people are offering like gift cards as payments and stuff, or is it an invoice process for you guys?
Yeah, it's a we do it through like I guess it's through like a bank wire. So the way it works, and we're a UK based company, so I don't know there might be a different decision for a US company, but essentially the assignment gets sent to them. It's a one pager. At the bottom has clear instructions and basically says once you submit, you send an email with this information, name and like they actually send their banking details to an email address. It goes to me. I'm the only recruiter here, and then I send it to accounts with approval, and then they just literally wire it. So we do actually just do wire the money.
Nice. Yeah, question from is it Nico? Sorry, apologies, not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike. So when I was recruiting in tech like 5 years ago, we would give these exercises and we would pay for them. But what we ended up doing was kind of stripping it of any applicability to our current business model. So what we were looking for were like key traits and qualities and like how they present and like how they interact and handle Q&A and field questions. And so we moved the model away from like them being able to implement it if they started in the role, like having a platform 30, 60, 90 day, plan, to more of these like exercises where we're just looking for key traits and qualities. On the technical side, we also moved away just from the lengthy take home assessments. And in candidate surveys, we actually saw better reviews of the whole process and like the time it took. The more lengthy the assignment was, the more turned off the candidate was about the process. And they also felt like the material that they produced was like free consulting
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
company without actually, even if they were paid, they were still like, it still feels kind of icky. So here, so my company is based out of the States, but I do recruiting in Israel.
Mhm.
We also have like been doing these assessments, but taking it as like a concept, like we just want you to teach on anything and build a micro learning for us. And
Mhm.
15 minutes, you're going to teach something to a panel, and we want to see if they've retained that information and then can implement and then handle Q&A after that. Like the projects that you're talking about, would you say that they're related to the company and that they can use that going forward? Or like how do you shape those and what's the ask?
Yeah, they're probably somewhere in the middle. So they're definitely not 30, 60, 90-day plans. We definitely don't do that. So it's not like put together your project plan or your whatever it is. It's skills based, so it is directly related to their role. So for example, like let's say for example, we hire an events manager, and so we will make up a fake event that's nothing to do with Pinpoint, for example. We'll give them the details and we'll give them a set of decisions, and we'll say here's your budget. Here's the event. Here's what we're hoping to get out of it. And just, like walk us through how you would like put together and we'll give them a timeline. We'll say like spend an hour on this essentially, and then walk us through how you would do that. So put together, we make it very clear, like whatever you want to do, you can do a deck, you can do a Notion page, you can mail us a poster board if you want. We don't, really care. We just want you to walk us through how you would tackle this problem. We really just want to understand how you work. We want to understand like how you would walk us through it. Like we do want to understand kind of like how you would collaborate with the team a bit. But it is directly related to their function, but not necessarily pinpoint, right? So it's kind of in the middle of those two things, it sounds like. But it's definitely not like a 90-day plan, and it's not, 10 hours and all of that. So yeah, totally agree with you. Yeah.
Amazing, fab. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the time. I'm just aware, obviously, we've hit the time limit. So, thank you, for everyone for joining, and obviously a huge thank you to Mike for sharing your expertise and your time today, and answering everyone's questions. We really appreciate your help today.
Thanks, everyone. Nice meeting you
Fab.
all.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.